Records are a kind of currency. There are many kinds of world records. Highest, longest, fastest, most hot dogs eaten in a minute. Leafing through a Guinness Book of Records, you'll see the passion and commitment each title inspires, no matter how odd. Both those setting them and those vying to overturn them. It was something I saw firsthand on a hill in Wales, as a Dunedin surveyor tried to settle the saga of the world's steepest street. Records are serious business.
I hope everyone got a bit of a chuckle out of this. I mean, we've proved that we're the steepest by a long way. You don't need a theodolite to work that out. You just got to walk up both. But hey, listen, two amazing streets. They're both awesome in their own ways. People of Dunedin, we're going to push this on. We're going to see if we can get the world record back.
New Zealanders had crowdfunded Toby to the tune of $8,000 in order to overrule Guinness and bring the world record back to Dunedin. Holding records carries an undeniable cachet, a celebrity, a buzz. Something that translates into real-world value, especially for, say, tourist attractions or public speakers. There are many kinds of records, but world firsts are what bring people to Antarctica. A world first is something special, something that once granted is yours to keep, a portal into the history books, particularly for solo record attempts. A big first attracts adventurers, sponsors, and attention like nobody's business, and Antarctica is full of them. For the right record, people have risked their lives, their reputations even. For an impossible first, there are few places explorers wouldn't go, which is exactly what explorer Colin O'Brady set out to do at the end of 2018, crossing the continent alone and without help. So why, years later, does his record attempt still inspire such controversy? And did he achieve exactly what he set out to do?
I will be attempting a world first. A solo, unsupported, unaided crossing of Antarctica.
Antarctica is the last place on Earth to be reached by humans. So how is it so difficult to say who got there first? And why does everyone want a slice of what seems to be the world's most inhospitable continent? My name is Thomas Bywater. In March 2020, while stranded on a ship in the Drake Passage, I had the opportunity to meet some of the adventurous characters drawn to Antarctica and learn some of its surprising episodes. Stories of archaeological hoaxes, murders in a continent without police, and a research station baby boom. In the span of just 200 years, the 7 countries with claims and permanent footholds at the bottom of the world have developed rich, sometimes contradictory histories, New Zealand amongst them. This podcast aims to explore some of these episodes and see if Antarctica's short history could go back further than first thought. This is Detour Antarctica. Colin Obrady must be stopped. Borg Ausland's reaction was shockingly out of character. It upset the club-like atmosphere of polar exploration. In 2020, Ausland was one of 50 people who broke ranks to accuse the American adventurer of lying. O'Brady is praising me as an inspiration, while at the same time making up stories, he said. Judge for yourself, but I call it dishonest, if not worse. The way they set about to pick apart O'Brady's record seems unreasonable, but from their point of view, other explorers had crossed the pole, going further, faster and earlier than him. If the ski had been any kind of first, it was unreasonable to compare it to those that went before. 10 people claim to have crossed Antarctica on skis. None of them can agree whose record counts. Colin was just the latest to stick his flagpole in. Antarctic exploration is done by a tiny group of driven individuals. They all know each other. If not personally, then they definitely know of each other's expeditions. Both Ausland and O'Brady are members of the same, very literal Explorers Club. It stands on New York's Madison Avenue and 70th, which is fitting. It's a privileged, cloistered setting, with a genteel exterior, hiding ruthless ambition. In many ways, Colin O'Brady's impossible first belongs to another era. It was a Phileas Fogg-like wager, bored, misdirected, white ambition. In any other century, it's the kind of dispute which might have been settled with pistols at dawn, not tweets and podcast appearances. You might wonder why it matters at all. It matters because Antarctica itself is a club. It's the only continent on Earth where territorial claims are set aside for peaceful exploration, where members sign up to a set of rules. The treaty. Cooperation and competition exist side by side. particularly as more countries venture into Antarctica and the old guard feel it becoming more crowded. Each is furiously rewriting their own stories and claims to the continent, in case someday they might benefit from them, in case colleagues at some point become adversaries. A professional adventurer, O'Brady made a career of claiming records, sometimes inventing new ones in order to set them. Writing about these achievements, he turned the story of his 2018 Antarctic mission into the book, The Impossible First. No individual has ever crossed the landmass of Antarctica alone without support and completely human-powered, proclaims the blurb. Hauling a sled 1,500 kilometres from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea, it was one of the most ambitious expeditions in memory. It was certainly the best publicised. It's not by accident the record attempt was set up as a race. O'Brady went head-to-head with British Army Captain Lewis Rudd. Reported by The Guardian to have sustained himself on Cadbury's chocolate and 3 biographies of Churchill, on the 56th day slog, he came in 2 days behind the American. It was a great race designed to echo the one between Scott and Amherstone a century earlier. Not everyone was impressed. Impossible was an overstatement, said Borg Ausland, who had crossed 3,000 kilometres of Antarctica solo, twice the distance of Colin's attempt. Having done so in 1997, 22 years before O'Brady, it certainly wasn't a first. In fact, there were 8 previous solo crossings by men and women. He was hardly the only person to find fault with O'Brady's adventures. 50 other explorers joined the calls for him to review his claim. But was it an issue of semantics, ignorance, or was it bending the truth for a better story and personal gain? The whole thing is odd, but not without precedent. The story of polar exploration is full of countless revised histories and forgotten firsts. But could there really be a blind spot the size of Antarctica? And could one man have purposefully exploited it for his own gain? Antarctic exploration is a place where legends are made. However, the heroic characters and myths rarely hold up to closer inspection. We remember the names of the Scotts, Shackletons and Hillarys and what they achieved, but often ignore their flaws. If you ask 7 different people who was first to Antarctica, you're likely to get 7 different answers. The Russians claim Fabian von Bellinghausen is their man. Sailing south through New Zealand's fjords in 1820, he was the first to see the ice of Terra Incognita. Meanwhile, the Americans claim John Davis was the first to step foot on the ice, roughly a year or so later, at the Antarctic Peninsula. If you ask Aotearoa's Ministry of Culture and Heritage, the name of New Zealander Alexander von Teuselmann has given us the first confirmed person to land on continental Antarctica. Part of a Norwegian sealing trip, even those on the expedition don't even acknowledge who was on the first boat, or if Tunzelman was even on the first landing party. Firsts are too easily led. Something supposedly objective and definitive, the more you dig, the more motives there are for raising expeditions, and some explorers above others. It's only recently that Kororo from the South Seas have been adopted into the national story. Legendary accounts of Maori explorers, such as Uita Rangiora, recalling seeing southern icebergs in a land not shone on by the sun. Similarly, there are myth-making exercises on the other side of Antarctica, making a case for voyagers from Tierra del Fuego crossing to the South Orkney Islands. They're all versions of the same story. We got here first. The same thing can be seen in each of these solo crossings, each a first in their own way, but it's every adventurer's word against the others, and these are a lot of very driven, self-determined individuals. First on a technicality is not a place I can see any of them wanting to be. However, the crude measurement of first has little space for nuance. Gold medals don't record whether you beat the competition by a mile or a millisecond, but the difference is massive. That, in essence, is the Colin O'Brady problem.
I live in Jackson Hole, Wyoming.
That's mountain time.
Yeah, exactly.
Speaking of mountains to mountain, how long has it been since you got back from the Himalayas?
I guess it's been almost exactly a month, yeah. So about a month we finally got back. It was a longer than normal season. We didn't summit until June 1st, which is almost as late as an ever summit ever comes.
But what does first mean to these explorers? It's hard to get a direct answer from Colin.
Records are meant to be broken, and I'll be the first one cheering the next iteration of this. I wouldn't like to be sitting in the shoes of the person that has so much sadness inside them that they have to lash out and tell lies publicly. It's just like, I look at that and go, oh man, that's a bummer that you're in that place. It's not a reflection of me, it's a reflection of the sadness that lives inside them, and I'm going to use my positivity and optimism to continue to inspire people to take on great challenges in their life. Even that's putting on running shoes for the first time and running a 5K. I get the thrill out of hearing people say, I read your book, I heard your story, and now I'm making this simple change in my life that's, made me a better father, a better mother, a better, parent, whatever. And I'm like, cool, that's what it's about for me, inspiring that change and positivity in the world at scale.
Even when you ask him, there's a guardedness, like he's looking for the right answer. Understandable, given how many people have called his motives into question. Other adventurers are seemingly more direct with their response.
Sometimes I honestly look at these interviews and I think I would just like to say, yeah, because I want to be this badass who achieves this world first. There come things like charity and inspiration and so on, but it would be a lie for me to say that this is the main reason. Likewise, I would say, knowing many other explorers, I never believe, knowing them well personally, that this is their motivation either.
That second answer might be at odds with O'Brady, but it comes from someone who might know him the best. Ocean rower Fiann spent 200 hours with O'Brady. Sharing a world record attempt and a cabin not much bigger than a car boot, they see the world from a very different angle.
It's a certain statement of psychological maturity. When you, for example, complete AA course for addicts, the first step of your improvement is to stop bullshitting yourself and just tell yourself the way the things are in terms of why you do it and what do you want, and that you care for things like pleasure and self-gratification. Stop denying it. I know this is not the answer that sells the best, but I really believe it. Hopefully it's going to be the next paradigm of explorers, and we will not bullshit people anymore that it is about charities or inspiring the youth of the world, but we will acknowledge, first of all, our self-gratification.
Colin and Fiann are joined by a shared world first, which is arguably more impressive than the solo crossing. The Drake Passage was something that had never been crossed by human power. On the periphery of Antarctica, it is often called the most dangerous stretch of ocean in the world. Setting off from Cape Horn with 5 other rowers, they claim to reach Antarctica by sheer will and muscle power alone. Joined by Andrew Town, Cameron Bellamy, Jamie Douglas Hamilton, John Peterson, and skipper Fiann, O'Brady was invited to take part and document the row for a TV show, and it was visceral viewing.
The biggest low of it is not losing distance itself, but having to squeeze into these tight cabins and tight, wet, stinking cabins when it's not fun and everybody is injured and dirty and so on, and you have to stay there for, I think once we stayed 24 hours, if I remember correctly, something like that. So it's that's I think the biggest low of it.
For Colin, the biggest challenge was adapting to a team pursuit.
One of the interesting things about being alone, the vulnerability is you're on your own. So if you make a mistake, it's on you. But it's also like, if you're tired, you can stop. If you're feeling really energetic one day, you can go forward. It doesn't depend on other people's, where they're at in any given day, like in a team dynamic. And so, exploring the team dynamic in the row, I think was totally, as you say, kind of flexing a different kind of muscle, but unique in its own way, and both, with its pros and cons. And it's a beautiful thing when 6 people on a rowboat, which was most often the case, all working together, all changing shifts when we needed to. One of the things that Fiann, I remember, said to me at the very end of the expedition is, he says, obviously Fiann has done, all these, big ocean crossings throughout his career, and he said, Colin, this is the very first time that I've been on a rowing expedition where nobody missed a single shift of rowing.
The ocean row was a follow-up to the Antarctic crossing. Colin was on top of the world, having just traversed the southern continent. But Fiann thought he might have a project of interest for the famous Antarctican. The most difficult part of any expedition record attempt is not in the doing, but the planning. Who do you involve? How do you fund it? Who else wants the title?
The pool of people capable of doing it is very, very narrow. And I sometimes think at any given time it's hardly anyone available, and sometimes the recruitment to protect the plans needs to happen in stealth mode, because that is the only way to not have someone steal the project for you. It also requires some sort of courage and a bit of risk-taking and having faith in your vision that already disqualifies many people who don't have it. I mean, I know many explorers who can only start working on the expedition when it's already sponsored or when somebody invites them.
Famously, Amundsen set out for the South Pole 2 months later than Captain Scott, but he was wise enough not to publicise his plans. But a certain amount of attention is important for any expedition. With the bare bones in place, Fiann needed a celebrity explorer to help carry the row over the line. So he called Colin, fresh from his polar crossing, with a reason to go back south.
Operating in Antarctica, from my experience of all the various expeditions I've done down there, is more complex, of course, than most places in the world, and for good reason, in my opinion. Of course, all the environmental protection, the fact that it's not an autonomous country, and the Antarctic Treaty, and IOTA, which is the governing body around all tourism and things that happen down there. There's a lot of, needless to say, there's a lot of red tape involved in going there, which of course adds a logistic challenge, but then of course adds a significant amount of financial costs as well. And so, there's one thing to dream up these expedition projects, and there's another thing to actually, pull them off, which requires a lot more than just dreaming about it. And unbeknownst to those guys, I've been thinking about doing an ocean rowing project for quite some time. I had, spent some time thinking about it and vetting different boats and things like that. Combining that with Antarctica, of course, my imagination was lighted up and excited to do my part to participate, and really myself, my wife, and my inner circle team were the people that actually brought together all the funding, all the logistics and everything to turn Fiann's dream/idea into reality.
With Colin's book, Impossible First, at the printers, he helped coin a name for the expedition, and it stuck. The Impossible Row. Impossible it was not. They made landfall on the 27th of December 2019. It was a remarkable achievement, especially given O'Brady had never sat in a boat before in his life.
Rowing wasn't the first thing that I kind of dove into head first. I love the sort of, the phrasing growth mindset, this belief that even if we don't possess the skills or the background or whatever in any given moment, that there is a way to quickly learn and adapt and bring on a new skill set. And I think that one of the things that was interesting about the Drake Passage Row, certainly before, I signed on to do the project with these guys, I had never, rowed before. And there was a couple of guys who I knew that were classmates of mine at Yale, Andrew and John, who were, really, really accomplished, river rowers. But, John had never been on a big expedition before. He was leaning into me heavily of like, hey man, usually when I race on a river rowboat, I'm rowing for 4 minutes as hard as I possibly can in perfect conditions on a sunny day with warm water, which is a very different thing than, taking care of yourself in one of the most dangerous environments in the world.
Life on board the ship for those 12 days was grueling. Rowing was pretty much non-stop. In spite of the confined space, if you weren't on the same shift, you might see little of each other, unless the rowers were forced to stop by bad weather.
So we had 6 guys on this boat, which was pretty cramped quarters when we were rowing, but now all of a sudden the 3 guys that aren't rowing also need to take shelter in these tiny little compartments, and Fiann and I were rowing on opposite shifts from one another, and so we were both in the stern cabin because the stern cabin has all of the GPS and the controls of the steering and all that kind of stuff. And that cabin is tiny. It's like the boot of a tiny little car or something like that. So when you're in there by yourself, it's claustrophobic. You're practically bumping your head on the ceiling. You can't stretch your legs out. And now you have both Fiann and I needing to be in there. I'm not a huge guy myself, but I'm not that small. I'm 6 foot tall, 175 pounds. But Fiann is like this very broad-chested, upper body oriented, rowing guy. And so all of a sudden, the two of us are smashed inside this tiny little compartment together. The only way we could do it was actually to be fully entangled and cuddling with each other. So imagine being wet, cold, freezing, tired, sleep deprived, and now you are, basically cuddled in the fetal position and practically on top of another human being. And I think the longest time we had, there was one time it was 25 hours uninterrupted. And while that's happening, the storms are raging, outside. The only reason we have the sea anchor up is because it's so stormy. So it's not as if we're just smashed in there and we have to cuddle, which would be uncomfortable in itself. But we're smashed in there and our boat is getting violently thrown up and down on these waves, and we're bashing into each other. And it's not like, hey, we got to do this for 30 minutes. It's like, hey, this might clear in 5 hours from now or something like that. There's no ripcord, so to speak, to pull you out of there. You just kind of have to ride out the storm.
In spite of these close quarters, the time spent pursuing the goal did not necessarily bring the explorers closer together. The boat, which was a little under 9 meters long, was a small place for competing egos.
I would say Colin's role was Colin was the host of the TV show, The Impossible Road, the show about this road. And as the host, he brought the producer who ended up being sponsor for the road, Discovery. And this was a relatively big contribution to the whole project in other end than performance. And that was his main contribution to the project and what I appreciated him for. And that's what we have given him, or I have given him the role of first mate. I mean, the title at least. So that's all fine until then. It's just maybe how to formulate it. Maybe we expected that in exchange, this is going to be a movie about us, but this movie turned out not only to be about him, but he also presented himself on many occasions as the leader of this expedition. Yeah, so this was entirely factually incorrect because the leader is the first in command, and the first in command was me, the captain, and Colin, first mate, was under my command. I have never passed on the command to him. So this is where I feel things didn't maybe work as planned in terms of how I thought he would contribute to the project, because in certain way he did contribute, but in certain way he checked out with what he contributed. Yeah,
they had, each one of them made history. The first expedition to reach Antarctica by human power alone. But Fiann felt as if the project he had launched had been misrepresented. He had been painted into the background of his own expedition.
People just copy-pasted the press releases that Colin sent around with his, PR agencies that were quite influential, and literally of all the a few hundreds of newspapers that published, only 5 made effort to really interview and listen to the story, and those wrote completely different story, like completely different. To not have me called the co-captain because I was not a co-captain, or to not have called Colin the leader, and so on. This kind of details, but still, it's a tough fight, and the most frustrating part is that you're not fighting for something that you would gain, but you are fighting for something that you already own, that is already yours, but you need to recover it. Yeah, I mean, it's not a very motivating place to be. I have put this expedition together, and I have conceived it, and I have recruited the people. If you see any confusion in media, it's just because someone was trying to introduce it in a different way, but the facts are facts. We can call it ego, but I think it's just human being. And again, it's a matter of if you acknowledge it or not. Because if you read Colin's versions, it's to inspire, people to help humanity and to spread love to humanity. You can literally see Rich Roll interview. It's how love fuels human potential and how love to humanity makes him, I can take it seriously. That's all. Yeah? A lot of explorers who are known not because they are good in the exploration field, but because they are good in marketing. And because this marketing is 70% of success, it outweighs the need for being a good explorer, because you can achieve so much by just being very good in marketing, yeah, and you can sell it very well. So this is actually quite difficult thing about our times that I personally don't like, that We have higher chances to succeed by being good in marketing than by doing something well. Yeah, and that's a bitter truth to face.
First at all costs is an expensive gamble. Some explorers' livelihoods are built on firsts. If you rely on firsts for your income, is there then a temptation to inflate your own role? Similarly, if you are defined by your accomplishments, how would it feel to see your own contributions overlooked? Firsts are, after all, lucrative, the stuff of best-selling books, the power to attract sponsors. Like the ever-growing fisherman's tale, there's a temptation to revise the telling, lean on certain aspects, embellish others. But as explorer Erik Larsen was quoted as telling Colin's team, the story as it is compelling enough. Perhaps there is a more healthy way at looking at the power of firsts. The value as a way to enable adventure, rather than needing the expeditions to chase them. Almost 20 years earlier, Dr. Mark Jones became the first person to kayak the length of the Antarctic Peninsula. Dropped off by Sir Peter Blake's ship, Seamaster, the team spent a month paddling from the Drake Passage to the edge of the continent at 66 degrees south. For the three-man team in kayaks, first was not the reason for going, but how they got there.
The place I'd read a lot about the Antarctic, and the only way I could ever see myself getting there was to be sponsored to go and do something weird. So we came up with this idea of sea kayaking the Antarctic Peninsula. I mean, we were adventurous folks anyway. We would have kayaked and mountaineered and different things. That's sort of our recreation. So it was just an extension of that and going, man, imagine if we did some world first thing down there and we managed to get the sponsorship to do this rather than having to pay for it. And so that's what we managed to do, and it was an extraordinary privilege. That was important for sponsorship.
Yep, there was the headline.
Yes, all of those things. They give you a really easy in to sponsorship. First one being Antarctica, so that's really sexy. Sponsors like to get on board for that, and then world first is the other. It's a key ingredient that just makes it easy. People always try and find some world first angle,
Firsts have always been powerful symbols, prone to being hijacked by other causes. When mountaineers Tenzing Norgay and Edmund Hillary returned from their 1953 Everest expedition, Hillary reported being deeply uncomfortable with the strong political feeling that their climb had provoked. When asked which of them was first to the summit, they had a response prepared. To a mountaineer, it is of no great consequence who actually sets foot first, was the reply both climbers stuck to. Perhaps this is part of the enduring appeal of their climb, almost 70 years later.
I think being the first is massively overrated. If anybody does it, it's the first for them, And I think, the first person probably has more unknowns than those that follow. And maybe the biggest unknown is just knowing it can be done safely for some things. But, those that do the second ascent or the second trip down the Antarctic Peninsula, it might be way more challenging because of the particular weather circumstances that they get thrown up. So being first is a good in for sponsorship, but to me it's kind of overrated as an accolade.
The problem with Colin O'Brady, as Aaron Teasdale puts it, is the problem with firsts. There's a lot of power in the way they are told and retold. Reporting on records is difficult to do, not just in doing justice to the scale of the achievement, but context, nuance, something that can get buried in a headline. Last year I saw it play out in real time. Climber Emily Harrington had just conquered El Capitan. The first woman to free climb the Golden Gate route in a day, it was an amazing piece of news that for people in local lockdowns captured excitement, adventure and the outdoors. It was reported on by news agencies and beamed around the world under the thrilling headline, "First woman free climbs El Cap in a day." Picked up by the BBC, CNN, The Guardian and the New Zealand Herald, it was a huge story. But, of course, wrong. 3 other women had free climbed El Cap in under 24 hours, just by different routes. Emily was mortified, accused by some of stealing the glory of climbers who went before her. These women were her heroes. Lynn Hill was the first person to free climb El Cap in under 24 hours, female or male, and almost 3 decades earlier. In 1997, however, it garnered few headlines around the world. Twitter wasn't a thing yet, for better or worse. The embarrassing mistake ended up on the corrections and clarification pages of various newspapers. But for her, it's a mistake that has stuck around. Google still auto-completes with Harrington's name when you ask who was the first woman to climb El Cap. Adventurers don't write their own press clippings. Once a story's out there, it's too late. They do, however, get to write their own front covers for their books. Which is possibly why The Impossible First ruffled so many feathers. Especially for an explorer as media-savvy as O'Brady. Any of that is your fault in trying to encapsulate the experience into something as pithy as an impossible first, an impossible row.
Well, first, it's unfortunate what happened to Emily. I know Emily, and she's an incredibly high integrity person, and I know that the last thing in the world was she was trying to step on, Lynn or the incredible female climbers that have come before her. And so I think vilifying the person, i.e. Emily, or, to your point, me, because a newspaper published X headline at scale around the world, when everything, you can only control what you say in the world, right? I can only control what I write in my book or in my Instagram or whatever. And, at some point you can't correct everything. And these things in the world of adventure, they do have significant amount of nuance, right? And so every single time I speak about my crossing, I say I'm the first person to cross the landmass of Antarctica, solo, no resupplies and fully human powered. Nobody is arguing about that. In fact, even the editor-in-chief of Nat Geo, who, took a very big swipe at me, said, "You're right. You actually did exactly what you said you did, and you did that at 100% what you did." So you're like, okay, so I did everything I said I did. I have always talked about it that way. So don't be upset with me. Like, that's not Emily's fault, right, in this situation. There's, Wired magazine wrote, "It is impossible to take enough calories to get across the continent of Antarctica." And it's direct reference to this project. I named my project The Impossible First because I like to try things that I might fail at. So no, I don't actually think that there's any blame on me, or it's disingenuous at all to call that project that.
Ultimately, Colin O'Brady completed a 54-day solo crossing, unpowered and without resupply. If you add enough caveats to your expedition, you too might have a first. But did he achieve what he set out to achieve? The first person to ski across Antarctica is a push. In 2012, Felicity Aston crossed the continent on skis solo and without the aid of a power sail. Unlike other explorers, Aston chooses not to comment on the race for first. But I think it's telling that in her book, Alone, she describes the moment when she first proposed her route. Identifying the pitfalls, she saw all the points where her record would be called into dispute, how others might try to drag her crossing down. Leaving resupply stations en route and following a portion of the Spot overland track on the South Pole Resupply Trail, it is also the route that Colin used. Ultimately, this disqualified her attempt as being unsupported. She knew her claim would be challenged, and that she would have to fight for her account before she even got there. Could Colin have been so naive as to think his attempt would be accepted without question?
The way that I kind of live my life is I live my life in a mindset of abundance, which is that, as it applies to what we're talking about right now, I think that there's enough success, accolades, life experience, beauty, joy, etc. in the world for all of us.
The response to the Colin O'Brady problem was simple. A classification system for polar adventurers. It was very Antarctic Adventure by Committee. Of course, there's an acronym. PECS, the Polar Expeditions Classification Scheme, describes its goal as standardizing the language of polar adventure, so that adventurers, media, and the public can accurately and equitably compare, promote, and immortalize polar journeys. Created by mostly the same group of explorers who had called Colin into question, it is supposed to be an unromantic, standardized method of benchmarking achievements. But when asked, Colin says he doesn't know much about it.
All I know is that when I crossed Antarctica, I followed the rule of the land that was widely published and widely acknowledged with the words unsupported and unassisted, meaning very specific things that are still published on ALE's website, as well as the same, rules that many people used before me, and many people we've talked about in this call: Ben Saunders, Henry Worsley, Felicity Aston, etc. And so, if people are trying to establish something that creates, I guess, more clarity and whatnot moving forward, I think that that's totally fine. I think the one mistake that those people are making would be to, what the legal profession would call an ex post facto law, right? It's like saying, hey, you did this in 1995 and it was totally legal, but then in 2020 we changed the law, we're sending you to prison. But, the only criticism I would have of it is if these people are trying to go back in the history books and say, this person didn't follow X, Y, and Z, definition. Well, it didn't even exist. They followed the definition of the day.
Last year, Guinness World Records partnered with PEX to oversee their world record certification for unpowered attempts. Should a team use the spot route by design or accident, unsupported status will be lost, it says. Colin's route following the overland resupply remains a problem. But that doesn't matter. As the record body says, he never submitted a claim in the first place.
Colin O'Brady has not made an application for this record title and has not been recommended by PEX for any Guinness World Records title.
According to Guinness, Antarctica is yet to be crossed solo and unsupported. Colin is proudly listed as the holder of 2 other records, including the Drake Passage Row. But he never registered for his hardest fought title. Asking him why, he said it had not been a priority. I doubt Amundsen filled out his Guinness record forms after he reached the pole, he said. Is Colin the victim of sporting rivalry? The vagary of operating at the limits of polar exploration? Or was he just testing the limits of what defined a first? He's been written into the history books of polar exploration, but not for the reasons he imagined. The number of explorers who have skied solo across the continent is still in single digits. It was an incredibly impressive feat by both O'Brady and Rudd. But if this crossing counts as a world record first, it's still impossible to say. In this podcast series, we've seen all manner of vainglorious attempts to claim parts of the seventh continent and its history. Extraordinary feats such as babies born in research stations. Myths and tenuous theories championed for political gain, while other inconvenient truths are left buried in the ice. With the help of the Antarcticans, contributors we have spoken to, I hope it has shone a light on the stories that have shaped the White Continent. Over the next decade, as New Zealand and its Antarctic partners get ready to ship out a new $350 million Scott base, we're likely only to hear more about the continent. It may become less empty, less difficult to get to, but the issues we've picked up on in this podcast are unlikely to change anytime soon. I hope it has shown the appeal, as well as some of the dangers, in the world's most pristine, untouched international science reserve. You have been listening to Detour Antarctica. This podcast has been written and voiced by me, Thomas Bywater. Each episode has been mixed and engineered by Tash Chittock, with special thanks to Ethan Sills, Francis Cook, Steph Holmes, Andrew Laxon, David Rowe, and Nadia Tolich. This series wouldn't have been possible without the translation of Damien Venuto, an input from the experts and scientists that call Antarctica home. Fiann Paul, Colin Obrady, and Mark Jones. For imagery, details, and Herald Premium content on the Antarctic stories we covered, and to find more podcasts like this one, go to nzherald.co.nz or listen on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts.